What makes a global superpower rise? What makes them fall? We're diving into Day of Empire by Amy Chua. It's a book with some, well, fascinating and sometimes pretty provocative answers.
Indeed. And what's really interesting here is how Chua takes millennia of history, just vast amounts of it, and distills it into this single, quite ingenious thesis. She basically argues that every single world hyperpower, from ancient Persia right up to the modern US, was, for its time, unusually pluralistic and tolerant while it was climbing to the top.
Okay, so tolerance. Yeah. That's the secret sauce for getting to be a hyperpower. But here's where it gets really interesting, kind of a twist, right? Chua also argues that the tolerance itself, well, it often plants the seeds for decline. How does she argue that tolerance can become this slow solvent, like she calls it, hitting a tipping point that leads to conflict?
Yeah, it's a really compelling paradox, and she backs it up with some incredible historical deep dives. Now, to really get her perspective, it helps to know a bit about her background, where she's coming from. Chua shares some personal stories. Both her parents were Chinese, but they grew up in the Philippines, actually under Japanese occupation. Her father's big dream was America. He got to Boston in '61, started with basically nothing. She talks about her childhood, finding strength and confidence in my peculiar family as they sort of discovered America together, becoming Americans.
Right, that really hits that American dream note.
Yeah.
But she also talks about the contradictions, doesn't she? Like, she mentions a kid making racist gestures at her, the slanty-eyed thing, and the history, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 hanging over things. And inside the family, too. Her parents constantly reminding them they were Chinese, not just by heritage, but by blood. It sounds complex.
Oh, absolutely. And this personal experience really informs her whole thesis, I think. She unpacks what Chinese even meant to her as a kid. Learning, the difference between Han Chinese and basically everyone else, often labeled foreign barbarians. Her mother really emphasized this idea of a pure Han bloodline. And yet, Chua herself ends up marrying a Jewish American. And she mentions her parents just doting on their mixed-blooded Mandarin-speaking American grandchildren. So that whole personal journey really mirrors the book's big themes about identity, belonging, and the complexities of tolerance.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then is clear. We want to explore this really complex idea, how tolerance can fuel a nation's rise to global dominance, but also how it might act as this slow solvent leading to decline. We'll use the specific historical examples Amy Chua lays out. And for you, the listener, we'll try to connect these patterns, ancient and modern, to see what they might mean for our world right now. Right, let's kick off where Chua does, basically the beginning. Achaemenid Persia, founded by Cyrus the Great. She calls them the first world dominant power. So what did tolerance even look like back then? How did it give them an edge?
Well, in their prime, Cyrus and Darius, these early Achaemenid kings, they really embraced what Chua terms strategic tolerance. Their big insight, really, was that real power came from using talent wherever you found it. Didn't matter where people came from. So they actively recruited the best artisans, craftsmen, laborers, warriors, you name it, from all across their huge, diverse empire. Like, think about Persepolis around 500 BC. It was a real melting pot. You had Greek doctors, Elamite scribes, Lydian woodworkers, Ionian stonecutters, all working together.
Wow, okay. So it wasn't just about grabbing labor. It was a conscious strategy to integrate diverse skills. Did that extend to culture and religion too?
Oh, definitely. And Chua argues this is absolutely key. Cyrus, for instance, interfered very little in the daily lives of the people they conquered. He let them keep their own gods, their own customs. He even embraced linguistic diversity for official stuff. Aramaic, Elamite, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Lydian were all used. Darius actually took pride in the empire's diversity. He called himself king of the countries containing all races. He didn't force Persian gods on anyone, even recognized the Torah as the law for the Israelites. And that openness, Chua argues, let the empire stretch, from the burning sands of Africa to the icebound border of China.
But she also notes a shift later on, right? Kind of hinting at that slow solvent idea. What changed?
Yeah, exactly. The beginning of the end for Persia, at least according to her analysis, often gets traced to Darius's son Xerxes. Now, Greek sources may be biased, but they paint him as cruel, intolerant, decadent. He apparently insisted more forcefully on the Persian character of the empire. He elevated the main Persian god, Ahura Mazda, kind of pushed other gods aside, and he reduced places like Egypt and Babylonia, which had been pretty autonomous, to essentially servitude. And this shift, this move away from pluralism towards imposing a single identity, it coincided with the empire starting to decline, losing battles. So the insight there is how that strategic tolerance, that advantage, could be undone by insisting on uniformity.
Okay, let's jump forward. Rome, another iconic Western empire. How did their approach to tolerance stack up against Persia? What was unique about their version of cosmopolitanism?
Rome, yeah. Especially during its peak, that second century golden age, the high empire, emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, they also practiced a kind of strategic tolerance. The empire became this common fatherland, as they put it, for all sorts of different peoples. And Chua highlights how Roman became less about where you were born and more a cultural identity you could adopt. This actually allowed elites from what the Romans considered savage and barbarous nations to get involved in the political process.
So anyone could become Roman if they basically adopted the culture. Remember that Emperor Claudius quote about the Gauls? So they're okay now, they stopped wearing trousers.
Yes, exactly. Claudius's point was that barbarism could be shed. The Romans really believed they had this civilizing mission. The idea was to bring, clashing wild speech to a common conversation through a common tongue and to provide humanity's civilization culture to people. So they encouraged building Roman-style houses, temples, educating the sons of local elites in Roman ways.
Sounds incredibly open for the time. But of course, Rome eventually fell. So there must have been limits to this tolerance, right? Where did it break down?
Oh, absolutely. There were limits. Big ones. Women, slaves, they were largely shut out of public life. That's crucial. And religion. Initially, Rome was pretty cosmopolitan. They'd often sort of capture foreign gods or merge them with their own Roman deities. Syncretism, basically. But tolerance definitely had its boundaries. Practices they thought were un-Roman or just morally repulsive, like human sacrifice, those were banned. And then Christianity came along. It was seen as this new cult that was different because it wouldn't make people swear oaths to the emperor. It claimed its own universal truth, challenging Rome's authority.
And this is where Chua's slow solvent idea really comes into focus for Rome, isn't it? How did these internal shifts start to unravel things?
Precisely. Now, historians debate the exact causes of Rome's fall. Obviously, it's complex. But Chua puts a lot of emphasis on the official embrace of Christianity, starting with Constantine's conversion around AD 312. Ironically, she argues, this move, intended to maybe unify, actually introduced a virulent strain of intolerance that undermined their older assimilation strategies. Paganism got suppressed. Ethnic conflict intensified, especially with Germanic immigrants. These groups were initially welcomed, even served in the army, but later faced what Chua calls apartheid policies. Imagine laws banning intermarriage, forbidding barbarian clothing. It created these deep, visible divisions, fueled resentment, broke down the social cohesion Rome had built. And this internal strife, really fueled by growing intolerance, she argues, was a major contributor to the sack of Rome, the empire falling apart. Her insight is powerful. Even a change aimed at unity, if it breeds intolerance, can end up tearing things apart.
Okay, let's pivot eastward. Tang Dynasty China, often called a golden age. How does tolerance fit into that picture? And does Chua find any surprises there?
Yeah, Tang China is fascinating in her analysis. She starts with a really striking detail. The Tang emperors themselves, people like Taizong, were likely no more than half Chinese. They came from this mixed Sino-Turkic aristocracy. And Taizong, even though he had a pretty brutal path to power, he apparently aimed to create a universal empire in which Chinese and barbarians would be equals. He brought foreign leaders into his government as generals, even let them use the royal surname Li.
Wow, that sounds incredibly open, especially considering the traditional Han emphasis on, well, purity. Almost revolutionary for the time.
It really was, on the surface. But Chua points out this crucial contradiction. She says, love of foreign things should not be confused with love of foreigners. Meaning, while the court might appreciate foreign music or art, the underlying Confucian bureaucracy, it remained deeply committed to the idea of inherent Chinese superiority. You see it in things like the Tang Code, their legal system. It actually called for segregation, limiting where foreigners could live, even exiling Chinese people who married foreigners. So you had this openness to foreign culture, but real reservations about foreign people. A tension there.
So despite that initial, maybe strategic openness, there was this underlying tension that eventually surfaced and contributed to their decline.
Exactly. Chua argues that in the late 8th century, intolerance seized Tang China. Foreigners started getting blamed for the empire's problems, especially the Uyghurs, who controlled the horse trade and apparently often abused their position. This growing xenophobia, this turning inward, she argues, played a significant role in the Tang Dynasty's decline. The takeaway seems to be how easily external pressures or internal anxieties can make a society turn against the very diversity that might have initially strengthened it.
Okay, from Tang China, let's tackle the Mongols. They often get stereotyped as just, brutal conquerors. Pure destruction. How does Amy Chua reinterpret their dominance through this lens of tolerance? Seems almost counterintuitive.
It does seem counterintuitive, but Chua makes a compelling case. She highlights how Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, did something radical. He reorganized Mongol society and, crucially, his army, not along the old tribal or kinship lines, but into these mixed interethnic squads of 10. The loyalty was to the squad, to the Khan, not necessarily to your old tribe. This fostered unity across different groups. And the Mongols, for all their, documented ruthlessness and conquest, they were, as Chua puts it, not hampered by religious zeal or bigotry, at least not initially. They recruited talent freely from the people they conquered: scribes, translators, architects, craftsmen from all over. She even mentions this brilliant multilingual Englishman who apparently chose to work for the Mongols rather than face excommunication back home.
That is surprising. So was this tolerance just purely pragmatic, a tool for control? Or did it run deeper, particularly someone like Kublai Khan in China?
Chua leans towards pragmatism being the main driver. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson who conquered southern China, is a prime example. On one hand, he brought in policies that seem pretty intolerant, right? Banning intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese, forbidding Chinese from learning the Mongol language or carrying weapons. Segregation, essentially. But at the same time, he personally embraced Chinese culture for himself and his court in a big way. He took a Chinese imperial title, built a Chinese-style capital, founded the Yuan dynasty. He promoted Chinese art, music, drama, even laying the groundwork for Peking opera. And this cultural embrace, Chua argues, helped him win the hearts and minds of many Chinese, leading to a period of relative peace and political unity. It was strategic.
But like the others, the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented. It didn't last. So their tolerance, however strategic, must have had limits or eventually failed.
That's right. It fragmented dramatically. And Chua notes, the decline of the empire was marked by one consistent feature: a stark turn toward intolerance, especially religious intolerance. Later, Mongol rulers started aligning themselves with powerful religious factions. They abandoned that earlier religious freedom. This led to, zealotry, scapegoating. She mentions a figure named Nowruz purging Buddhists, harassing Jews and Christians, even mass murder in some cases. And this internal conflict, this loss of pragmatic tolerance, contributed heavily to the empire breaking apart. The insight maybe is that while pragmatic tolerance can build an empire, maybe it's not enough to sustain it when internal politics shift towards rigid ideology or religious extremism.
Okay, let's shift to Europe. Spain, a major global power, but one that took a very sharp, very famous turn towards intolerance. What's Chua's take on Spain's unique path?
Spain is a really interesting case because, unlike a lot of Northern Europe at the time, it had these large, long-established minority populations, Muslims, the Mudéjars, and a significant Jewish community, actually the majority of Europe's Jews. And Chua suggests this long, if sometimes uneasy, coexistence actually made Spaniards, for a time, kind of worldlier about non-Christians than their neighbors. But then came 1492, a huge turning point. Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews. Muslims were forced to convert or leave shortly after. And then, of course, you have the Spanish Inquisition hunting down heretics, conversos, moriscos, burning, she notes, some 32,000 people at the stake over time. A brutal shift.
So a really conscious, almost zealous drive for purity that completely reversed that earlier, more complex reality.
Indeed, a very conscious effort. And Chua draws a direct line between what she calls Spain's fanatical, self-destructive intolerance through the 17th century and its eventual decline as a major power. Now, obviously, there were other factors: economic issues, wars, technological stagnation, but she argues many of these can be traced directly or indirectly to the Spanish crown's official embrace of religious purging and burning. Spain's whole identity became wrapped up in being the defender of the faith, which led them into these incredibly costly religious wars against Protestants, draining the treasury. The profound and perhaps sobering takeaway here is how pursuing ideological or religious purity, far from making a nation strong, can actually become a major self-inflicted wound, leading to decline.
Wow. Okay, now in complete contrast to Spain, Chua presents the Dutch Republic. Tiny place. How did they become a global heavyweight? What was their brand of tolerance?
Yeah, the Dutch are fascinating. Chua calls their rise extraordinary. This small republic became, for a time, the hegemonic power of the capitalist world economy. And how did they do it? Essentially by turning themselves into a haven for enterprising outcasts from the rest of Europe. Now, Chua is clear, this wasn't necessarily about high-minded ideals. There was a keenly calculating side to Dutch toleration. Leading figures back then explicitly argued for religious freedom precisely because it was good for business. It attracted talent and capital.
So it was largely an economic calculation for them, like Gold is your god, as some critics apparently said.
Pretty much, yeah. It was highly pragmatic. You had Protestants fleeing the southern Netherlands, Huguenots escaping France after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and later religious wars, German Lutherans, and crucially, Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. These Sephardic Jews, many were wealthy merchants and financiers. They poured capital into the Dutch Republic, Chua writes. They boosted bank reserves, helped fund the state, fueled Dutch colonialism, and were absolutely central in setting up the famous Amsterdam Stock Exchange. So by the mid-1600s, Amsterdam completely overtook places like Lisbon and Antwerp as a center for diamonds, finance, global trade. The insight is stark. Practical, even self-interested tolerance can be an incredibly powerful engine for economic growth and global influence.
They really did become the carriers of a world, as the saying went.
They absolutely did. And they used that wealth to expand globally, setting up the Dutch East India Company, the West India Company, both of which, Chua notes, were significantly founded and run by immigrants or their descendants. And even when there were moral objections, like some clergy complaining about vice and excess, drinking, smoking tobacco, the economic interests of the breweries and tobacco importers usually won out. It really highlights how, for the Dutch during their rise, commerce often trumped religious objections when it came to setting the boundaries of tolerance.
Okay, moving on to the next big one. Britain, the British Empire. It seems like they might blend some of Rome's cultural assimilation ideas with the Dutch economic pragmatism. Was Chua's analysis of Britain's tolerance strategy?
That's a good way to put it. Chua argues Britain's rise was fundamentally fueled by, and almost certainly would not have occurred, but for a dramatic shift away from centuries of destructive internal fighting English versus Scots, Protestants versus Catholics, towards policies of, striking openness and tolerance, especially after the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And she highlights three groups as absolutely key to this internal integration: Jews, Huguenot refugees again, and perhaps most significantly, the Scots.
The Scots. That's interesting. I mean, you think of the Act of Union, but I hadn't realized their role was considered that crucial to the empire's rise.
It's a really important point in her analysis. After the 1707 Act of Union formally joined England and Scotland, the English elite made a conscious effort to recruit Scots into building the empire. Scots were generally poorer than the English at the time, eager for opportunities, so they became disproportionately represented everywhere. The British Army, colonial administration posts, and critically, she argues, they were drivers of the Industrial Revolution. Think James Watt perfecting the steam engine, he was Scottish. Scottish firms were leaders in iron production, shipbuilding, huge impact.
Right. What about the financial side? Did that internal diversity play out there too?
Absolutely. Chua points out that Jewish financiers were instrumental in founding the London Stock Exchange. They brought expertise in diamond and bullion trading. People like Samson Gideon brokered crucial government loans. Huguenots also played a big role, helping fund the Bank of England. Now, you can't put an exact number on it, but Chua argues these contributions from minority groups were disproportionate and pivotal. So the core insight for Britain's rise is that this internal tolerance, integrating these different groups within Britain, was absolutely fundamental.
Okay, so Britain embraces these Enlightenment ideas, relatively speaking, at home. Integrates Scots, Huguenots, Jews. But what about overseas? In the vast empire, did that same tolerance apply?
And that's the massive contradiction for Britain, according to Chua. She calls it a profoundly schizophrenic position. While becoming more tolerant at home in places like India, British colonial rulers largely operated on assumptions of white Christian superiority and openly practiced pretty blatant ethnic and racial discrimination.
Yeah, that reminds me of the huge uprising in India in 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny. That was partly fueled by religious and cultural insensitivity, wasn't it?
Exactly. And Chua notes that after the mutiny, the official British government policy actually shifted towards a bit more religious tolerance, realizing they had messed up. But crucially, the Anglo-Indian business community, the Brits living and working in India, they actually moved in the opposite direction towards increasingly extreme intolerance. They refused to integrate Indians into their firms, maintain social distance, and this blatant racism, Chua argues, just intensified resentment among Indians, pushing even the elites towards the growing nationalist movement. The core problem, as she frames it, was Britain's fundamental inability or unwillingness to extend the same kind of tolerance and path to self-governance to its dark-skinned colonies like India, that it eventually granted to its white settler colonies like Canada and Australia. And this fundamental limit on tolerance, this hypocrisy, combined with the rising global calls for self-determination after the World Wars, ultimately contributed significantly to the empire breaking apart.
Which brings us finally to the United States, today's hyperpower. How does America's story fit Chua's thesis? Tolerance as both strength and potentially weakness.
Well, Chua basically argues that the U.S.'s rise is a direct product of America's continuing ability to attract, reward, and absorb the energy and ingenuity of vastly diverse groups. It's central to the story. Although, she's quick to point out, the early American colonies, not so tolerant. Think of the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay. They definitely weren't granting religious liberty to Baptists or Quakers.
Right, but the Founding Fathers, they consciously moved away from that, didn't they? Figures like Jefferson really championing religious freedom as a natural right.
They absolutely did. The Constitution explicitly forbids religious tests for holding federal office. That was radical. It reflected the founders' belief, Chua says, that free religious choice was the best way to avoid sectarian strife in a pluralistic society. It was pragmatic, too. Washington's famous line sums it up. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. Tolerance wasn't a favor, it was a right. And embedding this foundational tolerance in law, she argues, was a critical strategic choice for the new nation.
Okay, so that legal foundation, combined with vast resources, made the U.S. a magnet for immigrants, especially from Europe, really embodying that land of opportunity idea.
Precisely. Jefferson even asserted a natural right for people to leave their home country, which perfectly aligned with America's need for skilled labor. So despite restrictions back in Europe trying to keep skilled workers, millions poured in: Irish, German, Scandinavian, Italian, Eastern European Jews. And they brought crucial skills, technological secrets, know-how. They literally transformed America from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse.
But even with this massive influx, Chua argues America practiced its own form of selective strategic tolerance. What does she mean by that? What were the limits?
Yeah, this is a crucial and uncomfortable point she makes. While welcoming Europeans, relatively speaking, Chua states bluntly that the indigenous tribes of America were decimated, cordoned off, and displaced. They weren't part of this tolerant embrace. And of course, the massive, brutal exception of slavery meant that millions of African Americans were entirely excluded from this promise of liberty and opportunity for centuries. Chua suggests America prioritized European immigrants because they offered greater numbers and technologically superior skills at the time, tragically rationalizing the exclusion and oppression of others. It really highlights how American tolerance, while incredibly powerful in fueling its rise, was tragically far from universal from the start.
Okay, let's fast forward. Post-World War II, America is undeniably the global superpower. How does this dynamic of attracting talent continue to play out in that era?
It remains absolutely critical. Chua points out that the sheer manpower advantage the U.S. had in WWII, partly derived from those huge waves of pre-1920 immigration, was significant. And then, scientifically, immigrant scientists were directly responsible for game-changing advances. Think Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, other Jewish physicists fleeing Nazism, despite widespread anti-Semitism still existing in the U.S., even into the 1960s. These refugees were central to developing the atomic and hydrogen bombs, giving America the world's first nuclear weapons and a massive strategic edge in the Cold War.
And even more recently, Silicon Valley. It's so often called an immigrant creation. Does she see that fitting the pattern?
Oh, absolutely. She sees it as a prime example. The invention of the microchip, the rise of venture capital, these revolutions, she argues, were fueled by American openness. She highlights people like Arthur Rock, who basically invented modern venture capital, and Andrew Grove, a Hungarian immigrant who co-founded Intel and drove microprocessor development. It just underscores for her how American openness to immigrant talent and enterprise has been the engine behind incredible innovation and wealth creation right up to the present day. The core insight for modern America seems to be that its economic and technological power is deeply, deeply tied to its ongoing ability to attract, integrate, and unleash global talent.
So if tolerance and attracting talent are the keys to hyperpower status, what about potential rivals today? Does Chua think anyone else like China, the EU, or India fits the bill, or could challenge the U.S. based on this model?
It's a great question, and she dedicates a good chunk of the book to looking at exactly that. Let's take China first. Despite its incredible economic growth, she describes China as fundamentally a quintessential non-immigrant, ethnically based nation. Very Han-centric. Now, China is trying hard to lure back talented Chinese who are educated abroad, the sea turtles. But Chua argues it's still exceedingly unlikely that this would put China at the cutting edge of the human talent frontier. Why? Because, as she puts it, the world's most brilliant, most inventive, most skilled, and most enterprising will never all be found in one locale or among one ethnicity. You need global talent. Think about foreign experts working in China today. They are becoming Chinese citizens. The government isn't really trying to integrate them long-term into society. So relying mainly on the overseas Chinese diaspora for talent and investment, while powerful, she thinks has inherent limits compared to a system that can truly attract and absorb the best from anywhere.
And what about the European Union? It's expanded peacefully. It's a huge economic bloc built on certain shared values. How do they measure up?
The EU is interesting. It's definitely been a magnet for nations wanting to join, and it has strong protections for individual rights on paper. But Chua argues it has really struggled to attract and retain highly skilled professionals from outside the EU, especially compared to the US. Countries like Germany, for example, still face big shortages in fields like IT. And she points to issues like the ghettoization of some Muslim communities, rising anti-immigrant sentiment in various countries, incidents like the Danish cartoon controversy, as evidence of what she calls Europe's ongoing Muslim problem, or perhaps more broadly, challenges with integrating large non-European immigrant groups. This difficulty, she suggests, complicates Europe's ability to truly attract and exploit the most valuable human capital from all over the world, leaving it at a significant disadvantage relative to the United States in that global talent competition.
Right. And finally, India, the world's largest democracy, incredible internal diversity. Where do they stand?
India, she says, its very existence as a stable democracy, despite its extraordinary ethnic and religious diversity, is actually a triumph of tolerance in many ways. You know, figures like Gandhi and Nehru really championed pluralism as foundational to modern India. And they've made real strides, legally at least, against things like the old caste systems and tolerance. Plus, she notes India's most booming sectors are software, information technology, fields that absolutely depend on creativity and individual talent. So the potential is there. However, the huge challenges remain. Pervasive rural poverty, massive urban slums, corruption, issues like high maternal mortality rates. These persistent problems mean that, realistically, significant streams of the world's best and brightest aren't likely to pack up and move to India anytime soon, even if many talented Indians contribute globally. So, potential, but significant hurdles.
Okay, so bringing it all together, what does this historical tour mean for us, for you listening right now? Chua seems to argue the U.S. can't just rest on its laurels. The rules of the game have changed a bit.
Yeah, that's the core message for today, I think. Military might, conquest, the old tools of empire, they're less effective, maybe less acceptable than they used to be. So, connecting back to her main thesis, her ultimate warning seems to be that America's greatest historical advantage, its tolerance, its unique ability to attract and integrate diverse talent from everywhere, that very advantage is now potentially at risk. She actually quotes tech leaders from when she was writing, warning that things like visa caps were actively harming U.S. companies' ability to innovate because top global talent they wanted to hire was ending up going to competitors abroad.
Right. That's a really stark reminder of the strategic part of strategic tolerance. It's not just a fuzzy ideal. It's presented as a practical necessity for maintaining global leadership, especially in innovation. It underscores its ongoing relevance for America's future, doesn't it?
It really does. And she ends with this incredibly powerful personal anecdote about her own grandfather. He was 93, living in the U.S., comfortably as a permanent resident for years, but he insisted on going through the process and taking the U.S. citizenship test. And when she asked him why bother at 93, he apparently said, "Because America has given me so much, this is the greatest country, everyone wants to be American."
Wow. That's really moving. And it kind of leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought from Chua. She suggests that if America can kind of rediscover and stick to that path of strategic tolerance, if it can avoid the temptations of classic empire building, coercion, it could potentially remain the world's leading power. Not through force, but as a different kind of hyperpower, a hyperpower of opportunity, dynamism, and moral force.